Sabang. We will proceed directly to the presentation by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Dr. Thompson.
Thank you et bonjour Madame la Présidente et Messieurs les commissaires. Mon nom est Patty Thompson. I am the Director General of the Directorate of the Environmental and Radiation Protection and Assessment at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. In this capacity, with a team of over 60 specialist staff, we are responsible for the activities of the CNSC related to the assessment and monitoring of the health and environmental impacts of the facilities the CNSC regulates. I am an environmental toxicologist with postdoctoral and other research experience on the effects of metals, organics, and radionuclides. I'm also the Canadian representative on the International Atomic Energy Agency Radiation Safety Standards Committee, and in 2009 I was appointed by the French government as a member of the Institut de Radioprotection et de Sûreté Nucléaire Scientific Advisory Council. There are approximately 30 experts in radiation protection, dosimetry, toxicology, radiation biology, and epidemiology in my directorate, many with professional certificates, master degrees, and PhDs. We have staff representing the CNSC and Canada on national and international committees and organizations. In our work, we are assisted by Health Canada through a Memorandum of Understanding, and the CNSC also has a medical doctor available for advice as needed. With me today is Ms. Rachel Lane, the CNSC radiation epidemiologist. As part of her work at the CNSC, Ms. Lane has managed a number of research projects on the health effects of radiation on uranium miners, nuclear energy workers, and was heavily involved in the assessment of health effects on members of the public. Much of this work has led to publications in the peer-reviewed literature. Ms. Lane was also a lead writer and assessor for the work conducted by the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, or UNSCEAR, on the health consequences of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Also with me is Dr. Jimendra Muli, an environmental risk assessment specialist. Dr. Muli is a toxicologist with 20 years of experience assessing the impacts of organic and inorganic contaminants in the environment. Dr. Muli has primarily focused on specialist assessment of licensee submissions on the environmental impacts of nuclear facilities with respect to human health and terrestrial environment, environmental risk assessments, environmental monitoring, environmental compliance, and licensing. We also have with us today Ms. Julie Burt, one of our radiobiologists, and we have on the phone Ms. Melanie Rickard and Mr. Bertrand Thériault, two dosimetry specialists. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide an overview of how effects of radiation on human health are assessed and regulated by the CNSC. I will first discuss briefly the health effects of acrolein as it relates to OPG's DGR project, and then the rest of our presentation will focus on the radiation protection framework. To provide context, we will present the radiation risk models used by national and international organizations and the science on which they are based. We will also discuss what is known about the health effects of radiation and on cancer development. And we will briefly discuss the current research on tritium, nuclear energy workers, and members of the public conducted by the CNSC. We will then discuss the health impact of radiological contaminants of importance during the entire life cycle of the proposed DGR project, and finally, the acceptance criteria for the DGR project that are described in the long-term safety case. We will finish our presentation with the staff's conclusions. With respect to the non-radiological contaminants, acrolein was identified in the environmental impact statement as the main non-radiological contaminant of concern during site preparation and construction activities. It should be noted that acrolein is emitted from a number of sources, such as motor vehicles, forest fires, and wood stoves. The Bruce nuclear power plant diesel standby generators are also a source of acrolein on the site. The DGR project is predicted to make a small contribution to this, which may result in a slightly elevated exposure or an incremental risk. This incremental risk is not likely to cause health effects in the project area because of phenomena such as dispersion and dissipation of acrolein in the atmosphere. Nevertheless, we have recommended that acrolein levels in air at 4 receptor locations should be monitored during the site preparation, construction, and operation of the facility so that predictions can be confirmed. And if found to pose a risk on human health, then appropriate steps can be taken to mitigate against potential exposure to acrolein. I will now discuss several aspects related to radiation protection. At the international level, various organizations and committees of experts contribute to the science of radiation effects on humans and the development of recommendations for radiation protection framework. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, works towards the safe, secure, and peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology. The IAEA establishes standards that are the basis of regulation and requirements adopted by regulatory bodies such as the CNSC. The International Commission on Radiological Protection, or the ICRP, is an independent advisory body providing recommendations and guidance on radiation protection, and their recommendations are used by the IAEA and many countries, including Canada, as a basis of standards and guides. And finally, the UNSCEAR assesses and reports on the levels and effects of exposure to ionizing radiation. The work of UNSCEAR forms the scientific basis for the recommendations of the ICRP and other bodies. The CNSC requirements for radiation protection are based on the work and advice of these international bodies. CNSC staff also actively participates in the work of IAEA and UNSCEAR. The International Radiation Protection Organizations endorse a dose-response model called the Linear Non-Threshold Model, or LNT model, as a prudent model to estimate the risks of cancer from exposure to radiation. Despite widespread acceptance of the LNT model for regulatory purposes, other models based on scientific evidence from the peer-reviewed literature have been proposed to explain the relationship between radiation and cancer risk. Scientists proposed these alternate theories based on models of cellular and subcellular.
We've got technical difficulties.
I'm told we have technical difficulties. There's slides missing?
Yeah.
That's it, yeah. That's the one.
So we have a number of slides missing, apparently.
We missed one. That's right. We'll take a pause while we get this sorted out.
The acrolein side was missing. Second.
Our apologies for the technical problems. And so I'll start at the beginning of this slide. The International Radiation Protection Organizations endorse a dose-response model called the Linear Non-Threshold, or LNT model, as a prudent model to estimate the risks of cancer from exposure to radiation. Despite widespread acceptance of the LNT model for regulatory purposes, other models based on scientific evidence from the peer-reviewed literature have been proposed to explain the relationship between radiation exposure and cancer risk. Scientists have proposed these alternate theories based on models of cellular and subcellular responses to radiation at very low doses, that is, doses below about 50 millisievert, to represent findings of studies that do not follow the LNT model. On this picture, you will see the LNT model is the straight line that is extrapolated to zero, meaning that cancer risk or the probability of developing cancer will rise proportionately with increasing dose. The hypersensitivity model, which is represented by the orange line, suggests a greater risk at lower doses. The threshold model, represented by the purple line, implies that below a certain dose, there is no risk. And finally, the hormesis model, represented by the green line, suggests that low doses of radiation may even be protective or beneficial. There is scientific evidence at very low doses to support all four models. The CNSC, like other regulatory agencies, uses the LNT model in its approach to radiation protection as a prudent way to protect workers and members of the public. In relation to the LNT model, I would like to note that many statements, many interveners have stated that the BEER-7 report says that there is no safe dose of radiation. In fact, what the BEER-7 report states, and I quote, "At low levels of exposure, cancer risks associated with exposure are small relative to baseline or background risk." That's actually what the BEER-7 report says. The LNT model is based on information from the strongest epidemiological studies of exposed populations, and that is primarily the atomic bomb survivors. Accurate information on the health risk of atomic bomb survivors is only available at acute doses greater than approximately 100 millisievert. This cohort includes people of all ages and both sexes. The average radiation dose to atomic bomb survivors was approximately 200 millisievert. The LNT is used to extrapolate the risk from these high values to zero from the epidemiological data. Radiation biology studies are used to investigate the mechanisms of radiation effects at very low doses to provide a better estimate of risk at doses below about 100 millisieverts, since no firm epidemiological evidence exists at very low doses. International studies on large cohorts of nuclear energy workers and medically exposed populations generally support the radiation risk estimates from the atomic bomb survivor studies. Together, the information from epidemiology and radiation biology studies provide the basis of our current understanding, which is used in turn to set appropriate and protective dose limits for people of all ages. In line with international practice, the CNSC uses the linear non-threshold model for radiation protection purposes to help set dose limits and ALARA or as low as reasonably achievable requirements based on predicted cancer risk for a given dose. In other words, the LNT is a dose response model that describes how cancer risk varies with dose. Cancer is a primary health concern, is primary health effect of concern at low doses. Low doses are defined as doses in the range of 0 to 100 millisievert according to the ICRP and UNSCEAR. The Canadian dose limits are found in the CNSC radiation protection regulations. The limits for effective dose are 1 millisievert per year for a member of the public and 50 millisieverts in 1 year and 100 millisievert over a 5-year dosimetry period for nuclear energy workers. The annual doses to both members of the public and nuclear energy workers are typically well below regulatory limits due to the ALARA requirements. For example, at nuclear power plants, doses to workers are on average 2 millisievert per year, and that excludes workers with 0 doses, while doses to members of the public are less than 0.01 millisievert. Such low worker and public exposures relative to dose limits show the effectiveness of regulatory requirements for ALARA programs. To put the radiation dose limits in context, we will now describe the radiation risk factors. The ICRP provides lifetime risk estimates for cancer development and heritable effects due to an exposure to 1 sievert of radiation. So 1 sievert is 1,000 millisieverts. These estimates are called detriment-adjusted nominal risk coefficients. In other words, these are sex and age at exposure average lifetime estimates for a representative population. These risk estimates are based principally on cancer incidence data, that is, data on new cancer cases rather than mortality data. Cancer incidence data provides a more complete description of the cancer burden than do mortality data, particularly for cancers that have a high survival rate. As can be seen in the table on this slide, the ICRP has proposed a nominal risk coefficient for cancer for the whole population and for adult workers. For heritable effects, there are also detriment-adjusted nominal risk for the whole population and adult workers. The total risk for the whole population is 0.057 per sievert, and for adult workers it is 0.042 per sievert. In more simple terms, using the risk factors and the LNT model for the whole population, there is approximately 1 chance in 20,000 of developing cancer due to an exposure to 1 millisievert, which is the public dose limit. For adult workers, there is approximately 1 chance in 25,000 of developing cancer due to an exposure to the same dose, 1 millisievert. This compares to background cancer incidence rate in Canada of 2 out of every 5 Canadians developing cancer in their lifetime, or 8,000 in 20,000 Canadians. Although hereditary effects have never been observed in humans, the ICRP has assessed this risk based on information on animal data. With regards to determining the value of these nominal risk quotients, consideration has been given to the sex and different age groups. Cancer development can be divided into 3 phases. First, tumor initiation, tumor promotion, and malignant progression. Tumors initiate or start following damage to DNA. The tumor promotion stage is the amplification of the initial DNA damage by cellular responses in an attempt to keep the cell under control. Promoted cells move to the progression stage and continue to replicate uncontrollably as a result of the acquisition of additional alterations. Statements are still being made by some interveners that a single mutation from radiation causes cancer. Several decades ago, when radiation risks were first being investigated, not much was known about cancer development, and the one-hit theory was being used. Current science does not support the one-hit theory. Rather, research shows that no single gene defect causes cancer. Approximately 20 different mutations in cancer-related genes are required for a cancer to develop. The current scientific understanding of radiation and cancer risk is that typically radiation at high doses can initiate and promote cancer, while low doses of radiation tend to progress previously initiated cells. The cause of most cancers is still unknown. However, there are many risk factors that can contribute to cancer development, and these include age, tobacco use, alcohol use, poor diet, obesity, physical inactivity, family history, sunlight, and exposure to certain chemicals and other harmful substances. Radiation is just one of these many factors related to cancer, and it is not the main risk factor of concern for most types of cancer, and as mentioned on the previous slide, current science indicates that low doses of radiation tend to progress previously initiated cells. Extensive research on the health effects associated with radiation exposure has been and continues to be conducted internationally. CNSC staff review published literature. In addition, the CNSC has conducted research on nuclear energy workers, members of the public, tritium-specific studies, uranium-specific studies, and community-specific studies. These studies provide information directly relevant to the Canadian context and also contribute to the scientific body of knowledge. Because of public interest and public concern, tritium has been the topic of many research activities at the CNSC over the last few years. In 2007, the Tritium Studies Project was launched by CNSC staff at the request of the Commission. One such study focused on tritium and health. It found that adverse health effects due to current tritium exposure levels in Canada are highly unlikely, and that current dosimetry and biokinetic models for assessing those are acceptable for radiation protection purposes. 2 scientific papers from this project have been published to date. Research continues with studying the environmental behavior of tritium and the radiotoxicity of tritium. This research is being conducted in collaboration with other organizations. Several information documents on this work are available on the CNSC website. Canadian nuclear energy workers, including uranium miners, nuclear power plant workers, workers at Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and others have been monitored and researched for decades by the CNSC, Health Canada, Cancer Care Ontario, and academia. Several publications have resulted from this work on uranium miners and nuclear workers. A recent CNSC study completed in collaboration with a researcher from the University of California, San Francisco, on Canadian nuclear energy workers found no dose-related increase in the risk of solid cancer mortality among 42,228 workers from Hydro-Québec, New Brunswick Power, Ontario Hydro, and ACL workers first monitored starting in 1965. In this study, the mean gamma dose was 21.64 millisievert with a range of 0 to 678 millisievert, and the mean tritium dose was 3.02 millisievert with a range of 0 to 169 millisievert. This work has recently been accepted for publication in the British Journal of Cancer and clearly shows that there is no evidence of increased risk from tritium and gamma exposures. In Canada, research activities on populations living near nuclear facilities, parental exposures, and risk of childhood cancer, and the vulnerability of children have been conducted by various organizations since 1989. Several scientific publications have resulted from this work. A recent study by the CNSC on members of the public living within 25 kilometers of an Ontario nuclear power plant found no evidence of childhood leukemia clusters around any of the nuclear power plants, and this includes the Bruce site. No consistent pattern of cancer across all ages or sexes, and the incidence of all the cancers investigated for all groups is within the natural variation of disease in Ontario. The study, which we call the Radiological study, covered the period 1990 to 2008 for cancer incidence and 1985 to 2008 for radiation doses. This work has just been published in the Journal of Environmental Protection. I would also like to note that there's a recent study conducted in the vicinity of British nuclear power plants that have found no evidence of childhood leukemia. This has just been published in the British Journal of Cancer. We will now describe how exposures to radiation are estimated for the purposes of risk assessments. Risk assessments for projects like the DGR require public doses to be estimated to ensure they will remain below the public dose limits. Due to the very low levels of radioactivity in the environment from nuclear facilities, direct dose measurements are typically not practical for estimating doses to members of the public. Therefore, pathways analysis, as indicated on this slide, is conducted and involves measuring or estimating the presence of nuclear substances in the environment and modeling population exposures, so uptake of radioactivity by people. Doses are calculated by using relevant site-specific data, such as the amount of radiation at the release point, along with environmental transfer models. Typically, the dose estimates do provide a considerable amount of realism through the use of measured radionuclide concentrations in environmental media such as air, food, and water, and through the incorporation of data on the activities and dietary habits of people living in the vicinity of a source of radiation such as a nuclear power plant. This dose assessment methodology is consistently used in environmental impact studies. With regards to the intake of radionuclides, dose coefficients convert the amount of radionuclide taken into the body to a dose. This calculation accounts for how long the radionuclides remain in the body and how they distribute among organs and tissues in the body. These are dependent on age, and as such, those coefficients take age-dependent parameters such as retention rates into the body into account. Those coefficients are published by the ICRP. The ICRP also has published those coefficients for the inhalation and for the ingestion of a large number of different radionuclides and for several age groups. There are those coefficients for infants, 5, 10, and 15-year-olds, as well as for adults. The ICRP updates those coefficients from time to time based on new research on the behavior of radionuclides in the body. This past Saturday, during the hearing, Mr. Bourgeois requested an estimate of exposure to tritium from the highest measured value on his farm, which was 1,017 and 36 becquerels per liter. Before we do that, this slide provides the exposure to all radionuclides for all pathways using realistic site-specific data from surveys and assuming 19% of fruits and vegetables consumed from a local source. The value of 19% was obtained from surveys of residents around the Bruce site. In 2009, for Mr. Bourgeois' farm, the dose to an adult was 0.0044 millisievert, and for an infant, it was 0.0028 millisievert. Both these doses are well below the public dose limit of 1 millisievert per year. The average concentration of treated water in fruits and vegetables at Farm 14, which is Mr. Bourgeois' farm, in 2009 was measured at 664 becquerels per liter. One sample collected during outage work at the Bruce nuclear power plant was found to contain 1,736 becquerels per liter of treated water. This result is associated with a higher release rate for a short period of time, and other sampling results show this concentration was not maintained throughout the year. This slide presents in the first row the dose for an adult for just tritium based on the average value of 664 becquerels per liter. It is 0.0029 millisievert, which is about 2/3 of the dose from all radionuclides presented on the previous slide. The second row assumes that the concentration of 1,017 and 36 becquerels per liter is in all fruits and vegetables for an entire year. The dose, assuming 19% of fruits and vegetables are from this source, is 0.0076 millisieverts. If we assume 100% consumption of fruits and vegetables from this source, the dose would be 0.040 millisievert, which is the value on the last row. The doses around the Bruce site are based on radioactivity measured in the environment and consequently reflect the dose from all releases of radionuclides from all facilities on that site. This includes releases from the Western Waste Management Facility and its incinerator. The Western Waste Management Facility contributes about 3% of the airborne releases of radioactivity from the Bruce site. I would like to point that there's an error on this slide. So if you look at the third bullet that provides examples compared to the Ontario population, the last example, which is the fourth hyphen, should be replaced, is wrong, and should be replaced with similar trends in cancer incidence and mortality rates. So this past Saturday at the hearings, there were statements about the lack of health baseline data from the Bruce site. At the panel's request, we have included this information in our presentation. There are many administrative, mortality, and morbidity databases and large national health surveys in Canada. These sources of information are used to assess the health of Canadians. It is important to note that many of these databases are historical, some dating back as early as 1950, and can provide baseline health information for the community prior to the existence of the Bruce nuclear power plant. The Grey Bruce Public Health Unit conducts various health studies to communicate effectively and consistently with respect to the health and well-being of the citizens in Grey Bruce County. A lot of baseline information exists. For example, Bruce County has lower rates of stillbirths, lower rates of low birth weight, lower rates of congenital anomalies, similar rates of infant death, similar levels of childhood leukemia. For the period 1986 to 2004, trends in cancer incidence and mortality rates were similar to Ontario. A wealth of other health information is available for Grey Bruce County, including socio-demographic characteristics, health status, health behaviors, determinants of health and health inequalities, as well as healthy child development. The remaining part of our presentation focuses on the DGR project. Based on our knowledge of current research, we can assess the potential health impacts of the DGR project during the operation phase. For members of the public, doses associated with the release of tritium and carbon-14 via air and water pathways, as well as from external radiation from gamma radiation, were assessed. These doses are estimated to be in the order of 0.001 millisievert per year for members of the public. This dose is well below the public dose limit of 1 millisievert per year, and no adverse health effects are expected at this very low dose level, as shown in our recent analysis of cancer around nuclear power plants, and that's the Radiological study we talked about earlier. The health impacts of the DGR during the operation phase was also assessed for workers. Those assessments were carried out for workers based on the projected design, inventory, and operational practices of the DGR. Doses for nuclear energy workers who will work in and around the DGR will be controlled by OPG's exposure control limit of 10 millisievert per year. No adverse health effects are expected at this dose level. A preliminary ELARA assessment indicated modifications to the design and work control practices may need to be implemented in some cases to keep doses below the exposure control limit of 10 millisievert. OPG will be submitting a final ELARA assessment prior to the submission of an application to operate the DGR if this project moves forward. We will now discuss the acceptance criteria for the safety case and the results of the safety assessment. CNSC staff accepted OPG's proposed protection criteria for public radiological exposures for the normal evolution scenario. This was based on CNSC regulatory document G320, the 2007 recommendations of the ICRP, and the IEA Geological Disposal of Radioactive Waste Safety Requirements WSR4. The criteria are a dose constraint of 0.37 millisievert per year to critical groups, optimization below the dose constraint, doses calculated for average adult members of the critical group, and assessment encompasses the time of maximum calculated impact. For the normal evolution scenario, the estimated dose for a member of the public is a very small fraction of the dose constraint of 0.3 millisievert per year. The predicted dose is 1 times 10 to the minus 13 millisievert per year. No adverse health effects are expected at this very low dose. CNSC staff also accepted OPG's proposed protection criteria for public radiological exposure for the disruptive scenarios, including the human intrusion scenarios. This was based on CNSC Guide G320, the 2007 recommendations of the ICRP, and IEA WSR4. The criteria are a dose criterion of 1 millisievert per year for credible scenarios, and a scenario with calculated doses exceeding 1 millisievert per year are examined on a case-by-case basis. For the disruptive scenarios, the estimated doses for a member of the public range from 5 times 10 to the minus 10 millisievert per year to 80 millisievert per year. The 80 millisievert per year dose for the extreme failure scenario falls within the reference levels of 20 to 100 millisievert recommended by the ICRP in 2013. It is difficult to quantify the probability of failure of all shaft seals at once, which is the extreme failure scenario. However, staff considers that it is probably very low due to the following. First, current research shows that the main material used for shaft seals, which is the bentonite mixture, sand mixture, is chemically inert. Under the geochemical conditions in the host and cap rocks, there is no evidence based on current research of plausible mechanisms that could lead to its deterioration. The extreme variance scenario assumes that its permeability would increase to a value equivalent to one of sandy silt. And secondly, the shaft seal is not one unique barrier. It is a series of barriers separated by the bulkheads. The scenario assumes that all of these barriers fail together right at the time of failure. It should be kept in mind that the main purpose of conducting radiological assessment for each disruptive scenario, including the very extreme scenario, is to be able to bound the significance of the uncertainties related to either the geosphere or the repository design, and to identify if any additional monitoring or research activities would need to be undertaken if the project goes ahead. The results of these monitoring and research activities would serve to update the long-term safety case before closure. I will now provide staff's conclusions. Monitoring of acrolein is recommended to ensure it does not pose a risk to human health. In Canada, radiation doses to workers and members of the public are low and typically far below dose limits set out in the CNSC's radiation protection regulations. There is extensive scientific evidence that health effects are not observed at these low doses. The regulatory framework used for the safety case of the proposed DGR is protective of human health. Disruptive scenarios have been used appropriately in the long-term safety case to bound the significance of uncertainties and identify important elements of a research and follow-up program. The results of the environmental impact statement indicate that no measurable effects on health are expected from exposure to radiation should the DGR project move forward. We're available to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson.